Science fiction, what it's all about, at least according to Sam J. Lundwall, first published in Sweden in 1969, first published in North America in 1971 by Ace Books, reprinted later on in 1975. This review of the genre is 241 pages long, and you'll see a little bit about the history, about some of the concepts, books, magazines, even comics and movies. It does challenge some of the negatives it finds within the industry, while itself being quite a critical review. Let's take a look at this book. Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel. In an earlier video, I read large excerpts from Chapter 4 of this book. Lundwall had talked about the history of the genre, and then in Chapter 3 had talked about utopias. Chapter 4 was about dystopias. Lundwall has a way of stating things that challenge people, that poke the bear. I would imagine there was a lot of discussion, maybe even arguments, when he was around at some of the science fiction conventions. I just want to go through the table of contents, let you know what each chapter is about, and perhaps highlight a quote or two from each chapter. I think you'll find plenty to think about or to disagree with. Here's the table of contents. An introduction by Donald A. Wollheim. He's the editor that picked up this book for Ace Books. Lundwall himself did the translation from Swedish to English. Chapter 1 and 2 looked at what the history of the genre was. What were some of the first novels? How did they define speculative fiction or science fiction? Chapter 3 looked at utopias, and Chapter 4, the air-conditioned nightmare, was dystopias. But let's continue on from there. The magic unreality. That looks at fantasy. Of course, we have some talk about fairy tales in this section, heroes and swordplay, but we start to see that he considers space opera to be a bit of a branch in this area as well. Chapter 6 is then titled, Out in the Unknown. This is about space operas. Back in the other video when I talked about Chapter 4 of this book, we talked about dystopias, and Lundwall made a side comment about how defeatist the New Wave movement was. In this chapter, he compares the space opera to the New Wave movement. Starting on page 115. The space opera regards the future with hope and a positive attitude, although mostly overly naive and sometimes openly escapist. But as a contrast to the defeatist attitude of many recent works of science fiction, it certainly serves a purpose. Perhaps this particular branch is overdoing it, but that is the prerogative of writers anywhere, anytime. And then on page 140, science fiction stands out by its ability to cope with the changes of environment, values, and conduct. And if you take that away, you have nothing left except a literature screaming bloody murder at the slightest hint of anything new and unsuspected. This is retreating to the warm, secure womb, and I definitely do not think that that is science fiction's business to do so. The world and the human race are now faced with very real and pressing problems, and what we need are solutions or attempts at solutions, not literary dropouts. It is, of course, easier to blame someone else, society, one's mother, whatever comes handiest, and turn anti-intellectual than to face the problems and try to take a part in the inevitable change, doing something about it. Thus we have the New Wave, refusing to do anything but scream for help because they can't cope with the world in which they are living. This literature is, of course, significant and even interesting as a sign of the sickness in our time, but I think we've had a little too much of it during the last years. Going on the next page. At its best, science fiction is a magnificent vehicle for social analysis, as well as entertainment, pointing out bad solutions and offering new ones, speculating on the end products of processes already at work, experimenting with entirely new concepts and their effects on man and his world. This is something that no other branch of fiction can do, and this is enough to give science fiction a unique position. The main body of science fiction is indeed doing this, and the anti-future, anti-change, and anti-man writings of the New Wave type are really nothing but a small, though extremely vociferous, footnote to the genre. Science fiction cannot but gain by experimentation with new forms and ideas, but this experimentation should be done with an adult mind, looking forward into the future rather than running away from it. The moment we lose our sense of wonder and become scared instead of interested in what we see, be it good or bad, and refuse to cope with these new assumptions to the best of our abilities, we won't have science fiction anymore. Them's fighting words, and I would love to hear a rebuttal to this review. So I've invited Stephen E. Andrews of Outlaw Bookseller fame to join us. He loves the new wave, and he's ready to give a rebuttal to Lundwall. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for that. Well, I had to think about this, and I did encounter Lundwall once, but only as an audience member. He was speaking on a panel at a convention I was at, and I remember Brian Aldiss was on the same panel, and both Lundwall and Aldiss were both very big on the history of SF, and I was keener on Aldiss's view. But I think this sort of dismissal of the new wave very much highlights Sam J. Lundwall's Gernsbackian view of science fiction, which comes from right the way back at the beginning of genre SF, when the genre was named and codified by Hugo Gernsback and the people that followed him in the magazine sort of period. And Hugo Gernsback was very big in Astounding, and in his previous publications, the ones that came after, but the wonders of technology. And he saw SF as a means of positive education about the future. Now, I think this kind of highlighted Gernsback's misunderstanding of science fiction in its full emergence with H.G. Wells as an indicator of modernity, the period that science fiction grew up in and that we've lived through. And I think Lundwall carries that through. And I think that's typical of the more, shall we say, conservative genre SF-based, magazine SF-based, golden age type base that we saw coming to dominate the market for many years. And I think the thing with science fiction was that it needed to embrace modernism in order to ensure that it was relevant as modernity. So to get to a wider public, instead of burying its head in the sand of pulp escapism, which it had been doing for a long time, and there's nothing wrong with pulp escapism, it has its place, Lundwall and his kin rather sort of stuck to that rather conservative vision, which was under threat in the 1960s when the new wave came up. And genre science fiction had been indulging itself in this kind of thing since 1925. So they weren't really interested in reflecting the future in the way that they said they were. They didn't actually like the way things were going in the 1960s. And they weren't really in touch with what was happening in the counterculture and the wider culture, because, of course, that infected it in the late 60s and early 70s. So I think Lundwall and his kin were kind of stuck in a nostalgic fug. And in that way, I see Lundwall as typical of a kind of anti-intellectual, conservative, manifest destiny spirit, typified by John W. Campbell's approach in Astounding, where, for example, mankind could never be defeated. I also think this is typical of the failure of Lundwall's level of criticism to see that what he called the sense of wonder, and that was a phrase used in fandom. I'm trying to think when it was first used. I think it was the end of the 1930s, and I can't remember the name of the guy who first used it. And that was used a lot to justify what SF was about. And I don't think Lundwall realized that the sense of wonder is what the Romantics in the late 18th and early 19th century called the sublime. And Adam Roberts is somebody with a full understanding of this, because, of course, he teaches that period at Royal Holloway. And the sublime was a sense of awe, beauty, and terror of the natural universe. And that came up very strongly in Frankenstein, which is a classic romantic text, which is a reaction against the classical calm of the Enlightenment. So the sense of wonder has long existed in art. And I referred to this, I did a video called Frankenstein, Cyberpunk, and the Sublime, in which I talked about the connections between the two, because, of course, Case in Neuromancer, when he is unable to access the net, when he's unable to jack in, he misses the bodiless exaltation of cyberspace. And what he's searching for is the sublime. So the Romantics really, in what they called the sublime, was the sense of wonder. But what SF did was that it meshed it with a futurist rush of speed that came with the emergence of modern technology during the Industrial Revolution. So in that way, Lundwall is quite an unsophisticated critic, because he seemed to be unable to engage with a wider cultural paradigm, to conflate the sense of wonder with something which already existed, the sublime, but in a wider way because the way it was changed by modernity. Because, of course, the age of reason, the Enlightenment, led to that reaction of Romanticism, which led to modernism, and one of its core expressions, existentialism. Now, existentialism is quite a big thing in New Wave SF. Genre SF failed to engage with the sophisticated literary techniques of modernism that were typified by people like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. We're talking the 1920s here, until Alfred Bester came along and pointed the way. And it's interesting, if you look at the SF Encyclopedia, John Clute, in a number of articles, points out how science fiction was part of modernity, but it didn't engage with modernism, and that was something that held it back. And that was the key thing which really Michael Moorcock, particularly, more so than Harlan Ellison, wanted to bring into SF, because Moorcock and his kind Ballard and lots of other writers felt at that time that general fiction was rather dull and parochial. There were the angry young men in the UK, there was the Beat generation in the States, and the Beat generation were really important. But that it wasn't really moving forward. And one way to move fiction forward per se was to take the stuff of genre SF, the tropes, and expose them to modernist literary techniques. And, the fact is, you did get some quite sort of downbeat things coming out of the New Wave, especially in short stories and particularly in New Worlds. But it was that way that Bester, if you read, there's a wonderful story in The Dark Side of the Earth called The Pie Man. And I think The Pie Man is seminal to understanding where New Wave SF comes from. I've been meaning to do a video about that on my channel for ages, and I've mentioned it several times. So in a world like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now, we had a fractured mass media, mass production, atomic age consumerist landscape that needed a science fiction that tackled these things in literary techniques that matched our times. And that's where the New Wave was necessary. And that already existed and started to come into place in about 1950, when Galaxy and the magazine of science fiction and fantasy were formed and first published, because they started to work on social satire. So looking specifically at Lundwall, his sort of attitude to say dystopia versus utopia is really interesting, because dystopia became a major factor in genre SF in the 1950s through those two magazines who sought to satirize and reflect the McCarthyite society of the times. So if you look back to the very origins of SF, dystopia and the travel narrative are the two pillars of science fiction which emerged in classical writing and antiquity. So that's the very stuff that SF came from. But Gernsback, Lundwall and their chums, they only really wanted the travel narrative. They only wanted the exploration, the exploratory thing, that sort of going out there and discovering brave new worlds and what have you. And they really only wanted that optimistic vision, or a vision they saw as optimistic. And here Lundwall uses optimism versus pessimism in his argument, and he conflates pessimism with immaturity. I would really say it's more about an element of realism of the problems that we've confronted because of technology, which has been as much a bad thing as a good thing. It's been a stumbling block, because of course it's how it's used. So what he's really doing here is he's failing to accept the key tenet of science fiction, which is change, and it's technological and social change. And of course, in the 1960s, when the New Wave came along, whether it's the taboo-breaking New Wave of Harlan Ellison and Dangerous Visions, or whether it's the more literary modernism-based New Wave of the UK, which I think is the authentic one personally, really he's sort of shying away from what was happening in the world. It was a kind of nostalgic thing for the golden age and for those things. And, if you look at the New Wave, Harlan Ellison was a big champion of civil rights, and New Wave was as much a literature of protest as it was an adoption of the modernist literary technique. New Wave, as I say, could be dark, gloomy, nihilistic even, but it did embrace change, and it made SF more relevant to a new countercultural baby boomers. I mean, look at you and me. I mean, we were born in the same year. We come at the very end of the baby boom, and we grew up as kids in the 60s, and as we were adolescents by the end of the 70s. So we are part of that inescapably. And a lot of the New Wave writers won Hugo and Nebula awards, and they had popular fan support through the Hugos, and they had popular literary support through the Nebulas. So if you take a book like Michael Moorcock's The Final Programme, the first J. Cornelius book, it does depict a world which is chaotic, but it isn't bleak. It's a fun book. It's a book which has fun with the exact nature of the catastrophe. And I mean, if you look at people like, say, Samuel R. Delany, I mean, Delany's career took off like a rocket. He was really young when his first novel was published, and he won, Hugos and Nebulas really quickly. And he was a guy of color. He supposedly come along in a period where, people were a lot more conservative than they are now. So it does show how dated today's identity politics in SF actually is. Science fiction was ahead of the curve. And Thomas M. Dish, of course, was gay. And there is some evidence to suggest that one of the reasons why Dish didn't win things like Hugo's earlier on is that the old guard would get together and vote for no award. So when you see no award coming up in the listings of Hugo's, that's probably because the Golden Age guys got together and, they voted for no award instead of the people who would have won otherwise. So it's quite interesting stuff. And of course, female writers, even though they'd always been there, C.L. Moore, prominent in the 1930s. But Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ came along in that period as well, and obviously very, very important, still in print. And at the same time, some of the writers you could call New Wave, Delany, he took the oldest, hoariest genre SF cliche, the space opera, and he turned it on its head and he revived it and he made it colourful and exciting again. And he brought the sense of wonder, the sublime, back into it by approaching it with a glittering prose style, which left all the sort of, Golden Age guys in the shade. The only people who come close to him that way were Kuttner and Bester. So, there was the thing of them tackling real world issues, and also they were tackling genre issues as well, genre narratives as well. And, ironically, there's a period then where you can see in SF that the New Wave definitely won, because from around 1970 to the mid-80s, the traditions of genre SF merged with the New Wave, even in the USA, to create a more openness about being literary. You take something like Gregory Benford, a book like Timescape, which is really well written, but is nonetheless a solid genre SF novel. And I think since the late 80s, we saw a big renaissance of space opera, particularly in the UK from about 1986 onward. And that, in a way, backpedaled against what was happening with the legacy of New Wave, which was about literary quality, innovation, radical thinking. And SF retreated into familiar tropes. So I think now what we need is less of the sort of thinking that Lundwall would probably sort of put forward if he was still active, particularly and still with us and what have you. We now need a new wave, I think, particularly in the USA. But there you go. So I think really his arguments are about pessimism and optimism. You can't have optimism all the time. You can't have pessimism all the time. You need that balance. And great SF, I think, brings both things to the fore. But as I said many times, it is the business of the future to be dangerous. Drama is created by conflict. Conflict is created in fiction by bad things happening. And, it's the resolution of that conflict or ways of exploring how to resolve it that really makes for great SF that looks at social change and the sort of changes that technology will inevitably bring upon us. So that's my kind of rejoinder to Lundwall, really.
Well, I really appreciate you being able to jump on with me and give this rejoinder. One of the things I just will mention, and if you want to react to it, I understand Lundwall was about 30 years old when he wrote this book. So I'm not sure they had the width or breadth of knowledge of the field that he would have now. I would wonder what he would say now. I think he's still with us, maybe about 84 years old.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're listening, Sam, please do comment.
please rebut by all means. I think he is renowned even then for being very well read in the corpus of SF and for being one of the most important historians, and significantly a European genre SF historian, which is quite interesting. But yet his way of looking at science fiction does tie in a lot more with the American Golden Age Manifest Destiny sort of model than, say, for example, the skepticism of, say, Stanislaw Lem. Who Lem, I know you've read a lot of Lem as well, and that thing which he did many times, where he covered first contact many times, and the problem of knowledge, and Lem's idea that it was the unknowable, that to actually communicate with extraterrestrial life would be virtually impossible. And that could be seen to be pessimistic, but it does have the benefit of possible realism in it, and which means that his work will endure. Lem's work will endure if and when we ever do make contact with extraterrestrial life. There's no doubt that Solaris will be mentioned, whereas I'm not so sure some of the Golden Age guys will be, even though Murray Leinster came up with the term first contact first of all a long time ago. So who's to say? But everybody's view is important in SF. That's the thing, and it is about that debate and that argument. And it's not argument in terms of gainsaying; it's argument as a means of trying to get to a conclusion which is logical and which is factual at best, though it doesn't always turn out that way.
Thank you again, Stephen. I appreciate you jumping on and joining us here. We'll have a link in the description below. Please do go to his channel. Look for some great criticism, just like you found here, some awesome book hauls, lots of things to discuss there. And it's even beyond science fiction too. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Great stuff.
Perhaps you'd like to leave a comment about this one or other ones in this book. In the next chapter, he looks at women, robots, and other peculiarities, and those primarily are aliens. About women in science fiction, on page 145, he says, "The classic function of the woman, as depicted in gaudy colors on the covers of the pulp magazines, was to follow the hero as a kind of reverentially listening Dr. Watson. By her obvious ignorance of the most elementary things, she would give the hero the opportunity to launch into long explanations as to why the devious Hergians had invaded the solar system, or the workings of the new space warp. Between times she should be abducted by some horrible green monster with lots of fangs, which lovingly wound its tentacles around her appetizing form and disappeared with her. The hero himself only grudgingly wound his tentacles around the heroine, who, notwithstanding, loved him with a hopeless and virtuous passion, longing for the sweet moment when the mighty man would give up his toil for the universe and retire with her to the already mentioned paradisal asteroid. In her private life, the female appendage usually was the daughter to some ancient professor with long white hair and thick spectacles, who earned his keep by inventing curious machines now and then. In practice, she mostly served as an eye-catcher on the magazine covers, dressed in some very curious and decidedly unsafe transparent spacesuit and some scant lingerie. And then we have descriptions of robots as slaves. This is something actually I've been thinking about for a while, the way that robots are portrayed. When does someone have the right to self-determination? And lastly, aliens. Still representing those that are alien to us in our societies. Are we prejudiced against that is alien to us? What about self-preservation? The survival of our planet, of our people, of our nation? These continue to be explored in a lot of first contact stories. The next chapter is entitled The Mass Culture Strikes, and here we have lots about comic books and movies. It's an interesting survey of the two medias. Following that, we have the magazines. Here he finds that the genre of ideas works better in short stories and novellas than to something dragged out to a longer word count. Chapter 10 is Firewall! That's actually FIAWOL. It stands for Fandom is a Way of Life, and he says, as a motto, it isn't entirely unrealistic. This is an ode to fandom, to clubs and conventions. And the final chapter, The Future, asks what is coming of the genre. Once again, he wants to move past the New Wave movement, which is prominent at the time he writes this book. But even more so, he wants to leave some of the old authors and old ideas behind. He quotes John W. Campbell as the closing to his book. Will somebody tell me why the great old authors will not get off their literary tails and consider something new? They hate me for shoving new concepts and new ideas at them, and damn me for their lack of sense of wonder. The world rolls on, and we either roll with it or get left behind to mumble about the good old days. If you think science fiction is getting dull, it just possibly could be you. And I've got a pretty good idea of what's wrong, but I don't know anything that can be done about it. I don't know of anybody who's growing any younger. I found this an interesting read, just in the same way as you might find editorials an interesting read. I wouldn't recommend this for any science fiction fan's reference library, although it could fit in there, but it was interesting in a way in which it looked at themes and prejudices within the genre. So I give this book 6.5 out of 10. I'd love to hear your comments about some of the things that Lundwall said. He was a science fiction author as well, and you can find some of his work in the Daw line of books. Until next time, keep thinking and keep reading.